Hey there, and welcome back to Sleepless Society. If you're here with me now, chances are the world outside your window is finally gone quiet. This is our time, the sacred hours when the noise of the day fades away and the much louder, much weirder noise inside our own heads takes center stage. Tonight we're going to crank the volume on that inner noise, but we're dialing the timeline way back. So you think our generation is obsessed with mental health, therapy, and overthinking? Cute. The Victorians invented weird psychology before we even had Wi-Fi. Today, let's dive into the dusty, corset-tight world of the Victorian mind. And trust me, it's way stranger than your midnight Google searches about why do I feel dead inside. Chapter 1. The Obsession with Morality and Madness. When you picture the Victorian era, you probably imagine a world of contrasts. Soot-stained factories rising next to grand, ornate mansions. Incredible scientific progress alongside deep, dark superstition. People who were publicly prim and proper, and privately, we'll get to that. But the biggest, most important contrast of all, the one that defined everything, was the razor-thin line they drew between two simple words: moral and mad. The Victorians didn't just love tea and gloomy novels. They were also pathologically obsessed with labeling everything and everyone as one or the other. There was no gray area. You were either a shining example of civilized humanity or you were a broken, chaotic mess. A success or a failure. Good or crazy. Today, if you're struggling, you might talk to a therapist about your brain chemistry, your childhood trauma, your attachment style. We have a language for it, a framework that's rooted in science and medicine. The Victorians had a very different framework. For them, insanity wasn't a medical condition, it was a moral one. It was a disease of the soul. In an age of intense religious piety, particularly the rise of evangelicalism, which emphasized self-discipline, piety, and personal responsibility, a disordered mind was seen as a direct result of a disordered character. It was a weakness of will, a surrender to sin, a failure to control one's base animalistic impulses. Depression wasn't a chemical imbalance. It was a sign of spiritual laziness called melancholia. Anxiety wasn't a disorder. It was a case of nerves, a sign that you just weren't robust enough to handle the pressures of life. Your mental state was a direct reflection of your worth as a person. And if you failed the test, society had a place for you. The asylum. Now, asylums had been around for centuries, but the Victorians turned them into a massive, terrifyingly efficient industry. The most famous, or rather infamous, was London's Bethlem Royal Hospital, a name that over the centuries had been slurred into the word we still use for chaos and madness, Bedlam. For a long time, Bedlam was less a hospital, more a human zoo. It was a place of filth, chains, and unimaginable cruelty. In the 18th century, you could literally pay a penny on a Tuesday to go and gawp at the inmates, who were treated as a source of public amusement. It was a tourist attraction, a day out for the whole family to go and laugh at the lunatics. But by the Victorian era, a new, more enlightened idea began to emerge: moral treatment. It sounds so much nicer, doesn't it? It was a concept pioneered by reformers like William Tuke in England and Philippe Pinel in France, who argued that instead of treating the mentally ill like animals, they should be treated as moral beings who had simply lost their way and could be gently guided back to reason. This led to the construction of enormous, sprawling asylums, often built like grand country estates with beautiful rolling landscapes. The idea was to remove the patient from the corrupting chaos of the industrial city and place them in a calm, orderly, natural environment where their mind could heal. But what did this moral treatment actually involve? Well, this is where it gets both tragically misguided and darkly hilarious. The Victorians had an almost fanatical belief in the therapeutic power of routine and hard labor. They believed that a mind tangled in delusion and chaos could be straightened out by a rigid, unyielding daily schedule. Wake up at dawn, prayers, a simple breakfast, then work, hours and hours of it. Men would be put to work on the asylum farm or in workshops, while women would be assigned to the laundry or the kitchens. The core belief was that insanity was a form of idleness, and the cure was a good, hard day's work. And then there was the gardening. Oh, the gardening. The Victorians were obsessed with the idea that tending a garden could cure a troubled mind. The act of bringing order to a plot of land, of nurturing life from the soil, was seen as a direct metaphor for bringing order back to the psyche. It's a beautiful idea in a way, but it was applied as a one-size-fits-all cure for everything from schizophrenia to postpartum depression. Imagine that today. You go to a psychiatrist, pour your heart out about your crippling anxiety and existential dread, and at the end of the session, they just smile, hand you a shovel, and say, "Congrats, you're cured after planting these potatoes." The simple repetitive action will restore your moral fortitude. That'll be $200. While the intentions were sometimes good, the reality of these asylums was that they became dumping grounds. They were a convenient solution for a society that didn't know what to do with its inconvenient people. The poor, the elderly with dementia, the rebellious wives, the unmarried mothers. The definition of madness was stretched to cover anyone who didn't fit neatly into the Victorian social order. And nobody felt that more acutely than women. This brings us to the Victorians' #1 hit single on the madness charts, hysteria. The word itself comes from the ancient Greek for uterus, hystera, because for thousands of years, male doctors genuinely believed that a woman's uterus could become detached, wander around her body, and wreak emotional havoc. It sounds like a joke, but this was mainstream medical theory. By the Victorian era, the wandering uterus was out, but the diagnosis of hysteria became a catch-all term for literally any female behavior that men found confusing or inconvenient. Do you have anxiety? Hysteria. Are you irritable? Hysteria. Are you too interested in sex? Not interested enough in sex? Too intelligent? Not enough intelligent? Faint, nervous, or just generally have a personality? Classic case of hysteria. It was the perfect diagnosis. Its symptoms were so vague that it could be applied to anyone. It was a medical-sounding way to say, this woman is not behaving the way I want her to. The treatments were just as bizarre. Dr. Silas Weir Mitchell, a prominent American physician, invented the infamous rest cure. A woman diagnosed with hysteria would be confined to her bed for 6 to 8 weeks, forbidden from reading, writing, sewing, or even talking. She was often not even allowed to feed herself. The goal was to force her into a state of complete passive submission, to infantilize her until her rebellious spirit was broken and she could be remolded into a proper, placid woman. It was, in essence, a psychological prison. The writer Charlotte Kilman Gilman, who was subjected to the rest cure, later wrote her chilling masterpiece, The Yellow Wallpaper, as a direct attack on the treatment, a story that brilliantly captures the way this supposed cure could drive a person insane. And at the very end of this era, a young neurologist in Vienna named Sigmund Freud began to challenge these ideas. Working with patients diagnosed with hysteria, he started to suspect that their symptoms, the paralysis, the fainting spells, the anxiety, weren't coming from a wandering womb or a weak character. He proposed a radical idea, that they were coming from the mind itself, from deeply buried memories and repressed emotions. This was the birth of psychoanalysis, the talking cure. The idea that you could heal the mind with words, not with forced labor or isolation, was revolutionary. But before we get too smug and pat ourselves on the back for how far we've come, let's think about it. The Victorians used words like madness and hysteria as blunt instruments to enforce social norms. Don't we do the same, just with a different vocabulary? We live in an age of pop psychology, where words lifted from the therapist's office have become weapons in our everyday lives. We casually diagnose our ex-partners as narcissists after watching a few TikTok videos. We label any behavior we don't like as toxic. We throw around terms like gaslighting and codependency with the unshakable confidence of a seasoned clinician. We've swapped the Victorian moral framework for a therapeutic one. but the impulse is the same: to find a neat, simple label that explains away the messy, uncomfortable, and complicated reality of other people. It gives us a sense of control, a feeling of moral and intellectual superiority. 100 years ago, a man might have sent his troublesome wife to an asylum. Today, we just post a cryptic story about her on Instagram with the caption, "Protecting my peace." The language has changed, but the deep human need to label and dismiss what we don't understand is as Victorian as a top hat. Chapter 2. The Victorian love-hate relationship with emotions. So, if the ultimate fear was being labeled mad, what was the ideal? What was the state of mind that every respectable Victorian was supposed to aspire to? In a word, control. Absolute, ironclad, relentless self-control. Victorians were the OG masters of bottling it up. Stiff upper lip, baby. To show emotion, especially strong emotion, was to show a crack in your armor. It was a lapse in judgment, a moment of weakness, a sign that you were losing the constant internal battle against your own chaotic feelings. They didn't just dislike emotions, they were terrified of them. And this emotional terror played out very differently depending on who you were. For men, the ideal was the stoic, rational, unflappable gentleman. This wasn't just a personality type, it was a moral imperative. In an age of rapid industrialization, emotions were seen as messy and inefficient. You couldn't run a factory or an empire if you were prone to fits of passion or despair. The ideal Victorian man was the master of his domain, and that domain began with himself. He was supposed to be a rock of dependability for his family, a cool-headed decision-maker in his business, and a brave, unfeeling soldier for his country. This ideal of muscular Christianity, as it was sometimes called, linked physical strength, moral righteousness, and emotional restraint. To be a good man was to be a man who had successfully conquered his own inner world. Crying was unthinkable. Expressing fear was a disgrace. Admitting vulnerability was a form of social suicide. It was a lifetime of performing a very specific, very rigid version of masculinity. But what happens when you tell an entire population that a fundamental part of their human experience is forbidden? The emotions don't just vanish, they go underground. And the Victorian era had a massive, thriving emotional black market. The respectable gentleman who was a pillar of his community by day might be losing his family's fortune in a secret gambling den by night. The man who preached temperance might be a raging alcoholic behind closed doors. And then there was the opium. Laudanum, a tincture of opium and alcohol, was the Victorian equivalent of Xanax. It was cheaper than gin, available over the counter from any chemist, and it was used for everything from teething babies to calming female nerves. Millions of people from all social classes were quietly, respectably addicted to it. It was the socially acceptable way to numb the feelings you weren't allowed to have. The entire society was built on a foundation of public respectability and private desperation. The pressure to maintain the facade must have been immense, a constant low-grade psychological hum of anxiety. But if the men were trapped in an emotional straitjacket, the women were lost in an emotional house of mirrors. It was a psychological trap from which there was no escape. On the one hand, women were considered to be the more emotional sex by nature. They were supposed to be the sensitive, nurturing, compassionate heart of the home, the famous angel in the house, as the popular poem by Coventry Patmore described her. Her role was to be a source of selfless, gentle, emotional comfort for her husband and children. This was her biological and spiritual purpose. But, and this is a very big but, she was only allowed to feel the right kind of emotions. Sympathy, yes. Mild joy, of course. Selfless love, absolutely. But what about anger, passion, ambition, desire? Those were dangerous. Those were the emotions that tipped you over the edge from being a perfect angel into being a hysteric. So, the Victorian woman had to walk an impossible tightrope. She had to be emotional, but not too emotional. She had to be sensitive, but not so sensitive that she became a burden. She had to be passionate, but only about her God-given duties of managing a household and raising children. Any display of strong, selfish, or inconvenient feelings was a sign that her delicate nature was getting the better of her, and she was at risk of a complete mental collapse. And if she rejected this role entirely, if she was logical or ambitious or simply not interested in the domestic sphere, then she was branded a blue stock, a cold-hearted spinster, an unnatural, unsexed creature who was failing at the fundamental task of being a woman. You were damned if you did, and damned if you didn't. Too much feeling made you crazy, too little made you a monster. It was a system perfectly designed to make women doubt their own sanity, to convince them that their own authentic feelings were a symptom of a disease. Now, it's tempting to look back on all this with a sense of modern superiority. Look at those poor, repressed Victorians, we say, as we scroll through our perfectly curated Instagram feeds. But are we really so different? We've just gotten better at hiding the repression behind a different kind of performance. We live in the age of the curated self. We perform happiness, success, and effortless beauty for our followers, even if we're falling apart on the inside. We post about our amazing vacation, but not about the screaming fight we had with our partner in the hotel room. We post a smiling selfie with a caption about being unbothered, when in reality, we are very, very bothered. The Victorian parlor, where everyone gathered to perform their roles as respectable, well-behaved citizens, has been replaced by the social media feed, where we all perform our roles as happy, successful, and mentally stable individuals. The Victorians would have loved Instagram. It's the perfect place to show your fancy dress and hide your mental breakdown. The technology is new, but the deep human pressure to present a perfect, emotion-free facade to the world is the same. And just like the Victorians, our repressed emotions need an outlet. They had their novels, and we have our reality TV. The reason Victorian literature is so full of orphans, ghosts, doomed lovers, and breathtaking melodrama is because it was the one place where the culture allowed itself to feel. Reading a Charles Dickens novel was a national event, a form of collective catharsis where the entire country could weep together over the fate of a fictional character, because weeping over your own miserable, constrained life wasn't allowed. The raw, untamed passion of a novel like Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights, with its destructive, all-consuming love, was so shocking and so thrilling because it was the absolute antithesis of the polite, restrained courtships of the time. These books were a pressure valve, a safe space for a society that was emotionally suffocating. We do the same thing when we binge watch a show about messy, dramatic people or get deeply invested in celebrity gossip. It's a way to experience all the big, chaotic feelings of life from a safe, manageable distance. We may have traded the 3-volume novel for the 10-episode Netflix series, but we're still looking for the same thing: a place to put all the feelings we're not sure what to do with in our own lives.
Chapter 3. Science, Superstition, and Pseudoscience. So far, we've painted a picture of the Victorian mind as a pretty anxious and repressed place, but it was also an incredibly exciting, dynamic, and forward-thinking place. This was the era of Charles Darwin and the theory of evolution, of Michael Faraday and the discovery of electromagnetic induction, of the Industrial Revolution and the birth of the modern world. The Victorians had an almost religious faith in science, progress, and the power of human reason to solve any problem. Ah yes, the Victorians loved science, except when they confused it with absolute grade A, beautifully packaged nonsense. The 19th century was a golden age for pseudoscience, and it's not hard to see why. Psychology as we know it today didn't exist. It was a brand new, squishy field of inquiry, somewhere between medicine, philosophy, and outright guesswork. There were no established theories, no agreed-upon methods. It was the Wild West of the human mind, and everyone with a theory and a bit of charisma could set up shop as an expert. This created a fertile ground for some of the most wonderfully weird ideas you've ever heard. And at the top of the charts, the undisputed king of Victorian pseudoscience was phrenology. Phrenology was the brainchild of a German physician named Franz Joseph Gall, and the theory was deceptively simple. The brain, Gall argued, is not one single organ, but a collection of about 27 different mental organs, each one responsible for a specific personality trait. You had an organ for amativeness, your capacity for romantic love, an organ for philoprogenitivity, your love for your own children, an organ for destructiveness, cautiousness, self-esteem, and so on. And here's the kicker. The more developed one of these organs was, the bigger it was. And because the skull forms around the brain, a bigger organ would create a literal bump on your head. Therefore, by carefully measuring the lumps and bumps on a person's skull, a trained phrenologist could give you a complete and scientifically accurate reading of your character, your talents, and your moral failings. It sounds completely insane to us now, but the Victorians went wild for it. It had all the ingredients for a cultural phenomenon. It seemed scientific, with its complicated charts of the head and its fancy Latin-based names for the different faculties. It was simple to understand, and most importantly, it was incredibly practical. People used phrenology for everything. Employers would have prospective servants' heads read to make sure they didn't have an overly large acquisitiveness bump, which might make them prone to stealing. Young men and women would consult a phrenologist to see if their skulls were compatible for marriage. I'm sorry, darling, but your organ of inhabitiveness is tragically underdeveloped. You'll never be happy as a homemaker. Criminal justice was fascinated by it, using phrenology to support the idea of the born criminal, someone whose skull shape doomed them to a life of crime. It was like a horoscope, a Myers-Briggs test, and a DNA analysis all rolled into one, but with more gentle prodding of your scalp. Imagine someone feeling your forehead and saying, "Yep, this bump right here above your eye means you're bad at math and prone to telling white lies." It was a way to make the terrifying randomness of human personality feel neat, orderly, and predictable. But the Victorian strange dance between logic and nonsense didn't stop at the skull. This age of incredible scientific discovery was also, paradoxically, the age of the ghost. Spiritualism, the belief that the living could communicate with the spirits of the dead, exploded in popularity in the mid-19th century. It started in America with the Fox sisters, two young girls who claimed they could communicate with a spirit in their house through a series of mysterious rapping sounds. The phenomenon became a global sensation, and soon, parlors across Britain were being darkened for seances. People would gather around a table, hold hands, and wait for a medium to channel messages from the great beyond. Why would a society so obsessed with scientific progress be so into talking to ghosts? It actually makes perfect sense when you think about the context. On the one hand, traditional religious faith was being shaken to its core by discoveries like Darwin's theory of evolution. The old certainties were crumbling. On the other hand, science was producing wonders that seemed like magic. The telegraph could send a message across a continent in an instant. The phonograph could capture a human voice and play it back after the person was gone. If science could do all that, why couldn't it also bridge the gap between life and death? Spiritualism presented itself not as a faith, but as a science. It offered what it claimed to be empirical, repeatable proof of an afterlife. In an era with terrifyingly high mortality rates, where almost every family had lost a child, the comfort of knowing that your loved ones weren't gone forever, that you could still talk to them, was almost irresistible. It was the perfect fusion of the era's deepest anxieties and its greatest hopes. The seances themselves were a mix of genuine belief and theatrical trickery, with mediums using hidden contraptions to make tables levitate, ghostly hands appear out of thin air, and producing a strange cheesecloth-like substance called ectoplasm as physical proof of a spirit's presence. It was part grief counseling, part magic show. Phrenology and spiritualism are just the two most famous examples. The Victorian era was awash with other pseudoscientific fads, from mesmerism, the belief in an invisible animal magnetism that could be manipulated for healing, to physiognomy, the art of judging a person's character from their facial features. It was a time of immense curiosity and immense gullibility. People were desperately trying to understand the human mind, but the real scientific tools hadn't been invented yet, so they grabbed whatever they could find. a little bit of biology, a dash of folklore, a healthy dose of showmanship, and mixed it all together into a weird cocktail of belief. And before we get too high and mighty, let's be honest. Our own era is just as full of pseudoscience. It just comes with better graphic design. Millions of us consult our astrology apps before making a big decision, putting our faith in the position of distant planets. We categorize ourselves and everyone we know into one of the 16 Myers-Briggs personality types, which has been widely debunked by the modern psychology community. And then there's the entire universe of social media wellness culture. We're bombarded with unqualified TikTok psychology hacks that promise to cure our trauma in 60 seconds. We're told to raise our vibrations and manifest our dreams, which is really just mesmerism's animal magnetism repackaged for the Instagram age. We're still falling for the same old tricks, the promise of a simple, easy answer to the messy, complicated questions of who we are and why we're here. At least the Victorians didn't have TikTok. Can you imagine Freud doing thirst traps while talking about repressed desires? Or a phrenologist in a viral video pointing at different parts of his head while text bubbles pop up saying, 5 skull bumps that mean you're a secret genius. It's the same search for certainty, the same blend of hope and nonsense. We just have a better algorithm to deliver it to us.
Chapter 4. The Legacy of the Victorian Mindset. And so we arrive at our final destination on this strange tour of the Victorian psyche. We've explored their obsession with madness, their fear of emotion, and their love affair with pseudoscience. It's been a weird trip, full of ghosts and garden tools and some truly questionable medical advice. It's easy to look back at it all and think, wow, humanity has really come a long way. But has it? The big question, the one that's been hovering in the background this whole time, is what all of this has to do with us. So did we evolve past Victorian thinking? The honest answer is yes, and also a resounding, emphatic no. It's tempting to see the Victorians as a completely different species, a historical curiosity locked away in a museum. We look at their stiff portraits and their even stiffer social rules, and we feel a sense of distance, of progress. We've shed the corsets. We've embraced therapy. We live in a world of unprecedented freedom and self-expression. Or so we tell ourselves. But if you scratch just beneath the surface of our modern 21st century lives, you'll find the ghost of the Victorian mindset is not just haunting us. In many ways, it's still running the show. Their anxieties, their contradictions, their psychological hang-ups, they are the invisible architecture of our own minds. Let's start with mental health. We pride ourselves on being the generation that's finally ending the stigma. We have mental health awareness months. We share pastel-colored infographics about anxiety on Instagram. We use the language of therapy in our everyday conversations. And all of that is good. But has the fundamental stigma really gone away? The Victorians saw mental illness as a moral failing. We've supposedly replaced that with a medical model. But have we? Or have we just swapped the language of morality for the language of personal responsibility and wellness? The modern wellness industry, with its endless promotion of self-care, mindfulness, and positive thinking, often carries a subtle but powerful subtext that your mental health is entirely within your control. If you're still depressed or anxious, it's because you're not doing enough yoga, you're not drinking enough green juice, you're not meditating correctly, you're not manifesting hard enough. This quietly places the burden of illness back onto the individual, framing it not as a sin, but as a failure of self-optimization. It's the Victorian idea that madness is a weakness of will, just given a 21st century Lululemon-clad makeover. This legacy is glaringly obvious in our work lives. The modern obsession with grind culture, the relentless pressure to be productive every waking moment, to monetize our hobbies, to view rest as a form of laziness, that is a direct inheritance from the Victorian work ethic. The Victorian belief that an idle mind was the devil's playground has become our belief that an unoptimized minute is a wasted opportunity. The ideal employee in many corporate cultures is still the ideal Victorian gentleman, rational, unflappable, and completely devoid of messy human emotions. How many of us have been terrified to tell a boss that we need a day off for our mental health for fear of being seen as weak, unreliable, or not a team player? The pressure to show up, put on a brave face, and perform at 110% capacity, no matter what's going on inside, is the stiff upper lip in action. We've just traded the top hat for a laptop and the factory for an open-plan office. And the rigid gender roles that caused so much suffering, we're still wrestling with their ghosts every single day. The impossible emotional tightrope that Victorian women had to walk still exists. It's just been rebranded. It's the pressure to be the cool girl, the woman who is effortlessly beautiful, endlessly fun, and never ever needy or angry. It's the pressure on working mothers to do it all, to be a high-powered executive at the office and a perfect, nurturing angel in the house at home, and to never once admit that it's an impossible, soul-crushing standard. And for men, the Victorian straitjacket of masculinity is still suffocatingly tight. The devastatingly high rates of male suicide, the reluctance of men to seek help for their mental health, the cultural programming that teaches boys from a young age that real men don't cry, these are the direct, tragic consequences of an ideal that is over 150 years old. We are still paying the price for the Victorians' fear of a vulnerable man. But perhaps the most profound legacy of the Victorian mindset is our relationship with public judgment. The Victorians lived in a world of intense social surveillance. Their lives were governed by a labyrinthian code of etiquette, a set of rules so complex and so rigid that a single mistake, using the wrong piece of silverware, speaking to the wrong person, wearing the wrong thing, could lead to complete social ruin. Everyone was watching and everyone was judging. Sound familiar? We've recreated the Victorian parlor on a global scale. It's called the Internet. The fear of being publicly shamed, of having your reputation destroyed in an instant, is more intense now than it has ever been. Back then, one wrong fork at dinner. Now, one wrong tweet, and you're socially dead. The phenomenon of cancel culture, for all its modern complexities, is powered by a deeply Victorian impulse to publicly identify and cast out those who have violated the moral code of the day. The courtroom's bigger, the mob is faster, but the terror of saying the wrong thing and being ostracized is exactly the same. So where does this leave us? It leaves us here, in the quiet of the night, realizing that we're not so different after all. The world has changed beyond recognition, but the human mind is a much slower, more stubborn thing. The Victorians were the first generation to truly grapple with the anxieties of the modern world, with rapid technological change, with the loss of old certainties, with the feeling of being a tiny, anonymous cog in a massive, impersonal machine. Their psychological coping mechanisms, the repression, the rigid rules, the desperate search for meaning in science and superstition were their attempt to stay afloat in a world that felt like it was spinning out of control. And we're still using them. We're still repressed, we're still judgmental, and we're still trying to make sense of our own chaos. The Victorian mind wasn't just weird, it was a preview of us. The corsets are gone, but the pressure? Still tight. And maybe the first step to finally loosening it is to admit it's there at all. If you enjoyed laughing at the Victorians while secretly realizing we're not that different, don't forget to hit like, drop a comment, and subscribe. Because the only thing scarier than Victorian psychology is you missing the next episode.